a minister with a picture-perfect family.
They would sit up at attention, they wouldn't even move.
The operative word is control.
A wife vanished in the middle of the night.
This was something that would be very, very hard for the community to understand.
And a daughter who knows more than she can say.
The story was crazy.
After so many years of secrecy, can investigators find a demon hiding in plain sight? Early on the morning of December 5th, 2004, in a quiet Mobile, Alabama neighborhood, Pastor Anthony Hopkins delivers some terrible news to his 6 children and 2 stepchildren. Their mother, 36-year-old Arletha Hopkins, has walked out on the family.
Anthony sat down with the children and he told them how mother had abandoned them. She went off to California and got a job as a seamstress for a famous person, and she wasn't coming back.
Arletha's family back in Georgia is shocked by her sudden disappearance. They reach out to her repeatedly, but Arletha, it seems, does not want to be found.
The family members tried to contact Alletha on several occasions, but the numbers that they received, they would call and said the number is no longer in order, or she wouldn't return messages that were left for her. She didn't return any kind of text that was sent. So throughout the entire process of them trying to contact her, they never heard from Alletha.
For those who know Arletha well, it just doesn't make sense. Why would she walk out on a seemingly perfect life? Arletha Best grew up a God-fearing girl from small-town Georgia. She has one dream, to marry a good man and raise her own family in a Christian community. After a failed first marriage, it seems Arletha's dream has finally come true when she meets a kindred spirit named Anthony Hopkins.
Anthony Hopkins met Arletha in Georgia, and they were married in 1994. Arletha had 2 children from a previous marriage. Anthony adopted those as his own, and they began having their own children.
Within 10 years, Arletha and Anthony have 5 more children, and the family moves from Georgia to Alabama to Louisiana, then back to Alabama, so Anthony can pursue his dream of becoming a preacher.
In 2001, Anthony got his pastor's certificate from the APH Holiness Church of God in Mobile, and he began preaching at various churches in Mobile County.
Anthony's popularity as a traveling pastor quickly grows, and before long, the whole family gets in on the act, forming a gospel band with Arletha as the lead singer.
The family was a very talented group of kids. They each played their own instruments. They traveled throughout the southern region playing in different churches. They also were great singers as well.
And the kids seem as perfect off stage as they do on.
By all accounts, the children were meticulously dressed. They were always very, very nice and polite. They never acted up in church. They sat on the front row. They sat in sequential order by age.
Congregation thought the children was kind of strange because, you know, most children play, but these children acted like soldiers. They say they was perfect soldiers because even in church they would sit up at attention. They wouldn't even move unless one of the older children gives them permission.
By 2004, after moving from church to church throughout the South, the Hopkins family embraces the community of Mobile as their permanent home.
Mobile sits on Mobile Bay on the coast of Alabama. I think in Mobile and the South Alabama area, churches play a big part in the community, in families. Spirituality is a big part of everyday life here.
It seems the ideal place to raise the latest addition to their family, a son.
The neighborhood is a close-knit neighborhood. All the families pretty much know about each other. They talk, they sit on the porch, they even have cookouts together. You know, it's a close-knit neighborhood.
But nobody really knows the Hopkins family. Outside the church, they keep to themselves. The children are even homeschooled. Neighbors start to whisper that there's something odd going on behind the picture-perfect facade. And Arletha's unexplained disappearance only adds to the gossip. When Pastor Anthony's flock in Mobile becomes curious about his wife's disappearance, he offers up a strange explanation. His children listen in horror.
Anthony told his congregation, because Arletha was from Georgia, that he took her back to Georgia to give birth to their youngest child, where she died giving birth to him, and she was buried there in Georgia.
Pastor Hopkins' followers are devastated by his loss, but his children don't know what to believe.
The kids were confused because he had told them that she went off to California, and here the pastor stated that she died giving childbirth. And Anthony had told them, he told some people that out of respect for their mother, it would sound better than abandoning us.
In the weeks following Arletha's disappearance, Anthony soldiers on as a devoted single father. He continues to homeschool his children and insists they keep performing their gospel music.
After Arletha was gone, people thought very highly of Anthony, being that he was a single father raising 8 kids alone, and being as talented as they were, he was able to manage 8 kids all by himself.
Of course, he has a lot of help from his stepdaughter, 16-year-old 𝐂𝐥𝐿𝐸.
The oldest daughter, 𝐂𝐿Ene, assumed all of the duties of head of the household. She was responsible for the care of all of the children, making sure they were fed and clothed and educated, and she was the one who was responsible for making sure that life went on for those children.
Months, then years go by without word from Arletha, and no one questions her strange disappearance. But while things may appear normal on the surface, there's a horrible secret festering. A secret that will shake all of Mobile to its knees. Three years after the mysterious disappearance of Arletha Hopkins, her 8 children are still struggling to deal with her absence. No one more than her eldest daughter, 𝐂𝐿Ene. One morning in early 2008, a neighbor, Carolyn Kelly, spots 𝐂𝐿Ene in the nearby grass by her house.
This particular day, it was cold outside. 𝐂𝐿Ene was walking down the street with no shoes on, and she had on shorts. Carolyn felt sorry for her and invited her into the home, into her house to get warm, and gave her clothes to put on.
𝐂𝐿Ene was 19 at the time, and she told the neighbor that she was running away because she had an argument with her father.
After a little time in Carolyn's home, 𝐂𝐿Ene says she's heading home to work things out. Carolyn believes the incident is nothing more than a family feud. But 2 weeks later, the girl appears again.
𝐂𝐿Ene ran to that same neighbor's house, and she knocked on the door, and she was crying.
Carolyn can't help but notice scratches and bruises on Shaileen's arms and neck.
Carolyn asks Shailene what's going on, what's wrong with her. Shailene advises her that she's pregnant. Carolyn asks who's the father, and she tells her about this guy in Atlanta being the father. And she asks her, what's really going on with you? Shailene tells Carolyn, you really don't want to know what's going on with me.
Shailene lets on that Anthony is enraged over the pregnancy. But before she can explain further, the phone rings.
Anthony calls to the neighbor's house and speaks with Shailene. The neighbor picks up the phone and listens to the conversation. Anthony tells Shailene that everything he did was from his heart and that he loved her, and he wanted her to tell him that she loved him too.
Carolyn now suspects that there's something very wrong going on at the Hopkins home, but nothing could prepare her for the bombshell Shailene's about to drop.
After the neighbor continues to pressure her about the pregnancy, she tells the neighbor that she's pregnant by her stepfather, Anthony.
Horrified, Carolyn insists on calling the authorities, but Shailene protests.
Carolyn gave her an ultimatum. In order to stay in this house, you're going to need to talk to your pastor or the police. Shailene suggested that she talk to her pastor.
The pastor is from another local church and is an acquaintance of Anthony's.
The pastor really can't believe what she's saying because the fact that he knew Anthony and how Anthony was, and he couldn't believe that he would do something like that.
Instead of offering the young woman support, he calls her a liar.
He tells her that he's dealt with many stepdaughters before that is upset with their stepdad, and they seem to make up stories about what their stepdad had done to him, and he didn't want to get in that predicament again. Carolyn, at that point, got mad at the pastor, had told the pastor that he's supposed to be a man of God. It is his duty to guide this girl in the right direction, to make the right decision. But he continued to insist that he didn't want to have anything to do with her.
That's when Carolyn contacts the Mobile Police Department Child Advocacy Center.
I received a phone call about 12:40 in the afternoon from a neighbor of Anthony Hopkins who advised that Anthony's daughter was over there and told her that she had been having sex with her father. I asked how old the daughter was. She was 19 at the time. We were able to figure out that the sex had actually occurred prior to her being 18, so we advised her to come in for an interview.
What unfolds is a highly disturbing story.
We sat down and interviewed her, and she ended up talking to us about her having sex with her father. It began when she was around 11 or 12 years of age. And then it progressed from that point and continued until she was 19, at which point she ended up pregnant by him.
Anthony justified his action by telling Shailene it was okay. It's okay to do this. See, here it is in the Bible. Read it.
Anthony told Shailene that he loved her and that God would approve, and she was confused. He would use the Bible to manipulate her into believing that what they were doing was okay. He would pick out certain sections of the Bible, read them to her, to try and convince her that what they were doing was okay.
And Shailene may not be Anthony's only victim.
I went on to ask her about her siblings, whether or not she believed any of them had been sexually abused, and she told us that her second oldest sister, she believed had sex with her father, but she had no details to prove anything to that point.
He had started looking at her sister, Tawanda. She remembered him giving her those same type of looks when he wanted sex from her.
It is a deeply twisted family dynamic.
At one point, we believed that 𝐂𝐤𝐤𝐬 had got jealous of Tawana because Anthony was paying closer attention to her, and now that she was pregnant, that he was no longer interested in her, but in Tawana.
With the Hopkins family's darkest secrets finally coming to light, investigators are left to wonder, did Arletha leave the family because she knew about the abuse that was going on? Or is there something even more sinister still hiding in the Hopkins home? More than 3 years after Arletha Hopkins supposedly abandoned her husband Anthony and her 8 children, oldest daughter 𝐂𝐤𝐤𝐬 has revealed to police that she's pregnant with her stepfather's child. 𝐂𝐤𝐤𝐬 provides authorities with the details of her long-term sexual relationship with Anthony.
The interview was basically over with her about all the sexual contact between her and her father and everything, and she had told me earlier that her mother had died.
It doesn't seem the story could get any worse. That is, until Detective Michael Shavers does a little more probing. Detective Shavers asks an innocent, off-the-cuff question. The answer he gets suggests a crime of biblical proportions.
And I asked her, well, tell me how your mother died. And she said, I think my father killed her.
It's a tale so shocking, the detective has to wonder if it's truth or fiction.
The story was crazy. I mean, it was unbelievable. It had a lot of details to it, but you just wondered if she could make up something like that. And I said, well, where's your mother's body at? And she says, it's in the house.
Shavers goes hunting for evidence to back up 𝐂𝐤𝐤𝐬's outrageous claim.
So at that point, I proceeded to my office where we searched the computer records, trying to find any record of Miss Hopkins. We searched the driver's license, which her driver's license had actually expired in 2005 and hadn't been renewed, and searched all the other systems, and we were unable to find any record of her since 2005.
Shavers immediately contacts Detective 𝐂𝐤𝐞𝐬 in the homicide department.
At first, when we heard the story, we thought it was kind of bizarre, and we never heard anything like that before. But we had to go to the location and verify her story and to check it out to make sure.
After being told about the mother's death, I actually ended up typing a search warrant and ended up proceeding over to Judge Michael McMakin's house. He'd never heard anything like this and requested that we call him back and let him know whether or not we found a body in the house.
When they get there, the house is empty.
We ended up getting to the house with a search warrant and entered through the back door. The victim gave us a key to the house. We looked through the house and looked into each one of the rooms. The rooms were all very neat and tidy. The beds were made. Shoes were all lined up in a perfect line under the beds. There's a desk in there. No toys in there.
Anthony is out of town, preaching and performing with the other 7 kids, but his influence can be felt in every room of the home.
I'm a retired military vet, and the house itself was set up like a boot camp, like the dorms we used to do for inspection, all time ready inspection. The house was laid with bunk beds, the drawers and desks were lined in order. Even the kids' bikes were lined from the tallest to the smallest. Even the balls in the corner were neatly placed and arranged by color. It was all like a military manner.
Well, the operative word is control. Some people have this inherent need to be in control of all aspects of their environment, and that includes right down to the family.
𝐂𝐤𝐤𝐬𝐬 points detectives to a locked door.
As we open the door, you can start to see the flies start to gather in the doorway.
You could smell the smell of decomp body, so there was no doubt that there was some kind of body around there.
It doesn't take long for police to spot what they're looking for.
It was a small white freezer with tape wrapped around it to seal it, which kind of made my thoughts go from, you know, well, it's really not true to, uh-oh, it's becoming real.
Inside the freezer, something out of a horror movie.
You could see a mass of something inside the freezer. You couldn't really tell what it was at that point in time. You'd go over and look in the freezer. You could look down the side of the freezer and you could actually make out the web of a hand. I mean, it's unbelievable that there's actually a body inside the freezer.
My heart started racing. It was like, oh my God, what do we do here next?
Dr. 𝐁𝐥𝐸𝐿, medical examiner for the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, is called to the scene.
Well, we wanted to be sure that we did this in the appropriate fashion, so we removed the entire freezer and the contents to our facility here in Mobile for examination.
Even at the lab, extracting the corpse from the freezer is no easy task.
It was a real problem because the freezer had a lot of insulating material to it. So we couldn't just remove, and the block was stuck to the inside of the insulation. So we couldn't just remove the remains. We had to actually get the jaws of life and strip very carefully so we didn't introduce any artifact to the remains, any injuries that we would have created, and take a look at the remains after they had had a chance to thaw.
Once the body is thawed, dental records confirm that the body is that of Arletha Hopkins, but the medical examiner is unable to determine how she died.
We went on to look at the bony material and asked experts in the field to determine if there were any knife marks, any knife wounds, or any other lesions that they could help us with. And we pursued things such as DNA and further analyses in that regard. We couldn't determine a specific cause of death in this case, but the individual being placed in a freezer is certainly very unusual, highly suspicious.
Police now know that Arletha never took a trip to California, and she never went home to Georgia. Instead, this devoted mother and beloved member of the community has spent more than 3 long years in a deep freeze. But how did she meet this grisly end?
At this particular time, we brought in blood specialists from the Alabama Department of Forensic Science, where they spray luminol in each room trying to detect blood splatter.
Sure enough, the luminol reveals the traces of old blood on the fireplace in the master bedroom. That's not all this chemical exposes.
We also sprayed Shalene's bedroom for traces of semen. We did detect traces of semen on her sheets, which were also collected as evidence.
Continuing the search for evidence, Assistant District Attorney Ashley Rich picks up on a strange clue.
As we moved from room to room, we saw a lot of pictures of the family, but none of those pictures had Arletha in the family photos. Arletha was their mother. Arletha was a large part of their life, and there were absolutely no pictures, no evidence whatsoever that Arletha had a part of that household at all. We eventually found the photographs of the family with Arletha in a duffel bag in a travel trailer in the driveway of the home, kept tucked neatly away in a cabinet.
This is by design on Hopkins' part. It's a morbid effort on his behalf to remove any symbolic representation of his former spouse in the eyes of the children. And children not having the cognitive development stages and that we as adults have, will more easily forget the presence of their mother in the house.
From the moment that I was called to the scene of this crime, it was very, very difficult to fathom that something like this had happened in our community. As we learned more and we learned of the details of what actually happened in that home, I knew that this was something that would be very, very hard for the community to understand.
The forensic team has confirmed 𝐂𝐿𝑒ne's unbelievable tale of sexual abuse and murder. Now investigators want the rest of the story. But as they peel back the layers, things are only going to get more perverse. Investigators in Mobile, Alabama have discovered Arletha Hopkins, the wife of preacher Anthony Hopkins and mother of 8, dead in a family freezer. Now they want to know how she was killed and why. Reluctantly, the victim's 19-year-old daughter, 𝐂𝐿𝑒ne, reveals what happened that night 3.5 years earlier.
On the night of the horrific argument, Arletha had actually seen Anthony touching and fondling 𝐂𝐿𝑒ne, his oldest stepdaughter, behind the door.
Arletha throws Anthony out of the house. She banishes him from their lives and locks the door behind him.
At this particular point, Arletha came to 𝐂𝐿𝑒ne and asked, do you want to go with me or do you want to stay here with your father? 𝐂𝐿𝑒ne was so distraught at that point that she didn't want to choose between either one because she didn't want her family to break up.
After Arletha kicked Anthony out of the house, Arletha said to 𝐂𝐿𝑒ne, I would rather die than let someone abuse you.
Words that will haunt the teenage girl forever. Later that night, Anthony knocks on 𝐂𝐿𝑒ne's window.
She saw the person, the only person that she knew as a father figure. She saw the person that had raised her, but he was also the person who was manipulating her, who was brainwashing her, who was using the Bible to get her to do these horrible things that she didn't think were good or right. Here he is at her window. She wants to keep her family together. She wants to make sure that they are together as a family unit.
So 𝐂𝐿𝑒ne lets Anthony back in the house.
And the fact that she was a victim in no way means that she will necessarily reject her father, as a father. The controlling relationship that he had over her very likely instilled some degree of allegiance that she would maintain in spite of whatever had transpired.
Anthony assures 𝐂𝐿𝑒ne he'll make things right with her mother.
When she lets him in the house, some way, Arletha hears this and goes to 𝐂𝐿𝑒ne's room and bangs on the door and tells Anthony, get out of here, get out of here. You don't have no business in here. Eventually, Anthony goes outside of the room and pushes Arletha into her room. And he tells the kids, stay in the room and don't come out until I tell you. Then he goes into the room where the kids only hear a bunch of banging, knocking over of things, and a bunch of noise rambling inside of that room.
Anthony and Arletha were arguing, they were fighting, there was screaming going on in the bedroom. 𝐂𝐿𝑒ne was in a separate bedroom from her parents. She was hearing this arguing and fighting going on. She heard a thump. She went into the room to check on the safety of the baby because the baby was screaming, crying, a very new infant baby. And when she walked into that room, she saw her mother on the floor.
And she noticed that her mother was kicking her feet up and down as though she was gasping for air and saying help.
The last thing she saw was her father standing over Arletha's head on that floor in that bedroom.
Anthony orders 𝐂𝐿𝑒ne out of the room, so she picks up the baby and runs. By the time she returns to her siblings, the house has gone quiet.
𝐂𝐥𝐤𝐚 tries to calm the other children down and get them to sleep. And as soon as she does that, Anthony comes into the room and tells 𝐂𝐥𝐤𝐚 that her mother's dead. He said he snapped and that God wanted them to clean this up and that they needed to keep the family together.
It's a shocking story, but the case is far from over, especially with Anthony Hopkins' whereabouts unknown. All 𝐂𝐥𝐤𝐚 knows is that her stepfather and siblings are performing out of town. Investigators are determined to bring him home now.
The vehicle that Anthony Hopkins was driving was a vehicle that he had financed, and the finance company installed a GPS tracking device inside the vehicle to locate it if they had to repossess it. This device is what was used to locate the vehicle.
Mobile police track Anthony to a church 70 miles away in an isolated area of Jackson, Alabama, where gospel music can be heard coming from inside.
Well, I entered the front of the church and I came into the foyer. And when I got into the foyer, I noticed that there was swinging doors going into the chapel of the church. So I looked through the crack of the swinging doors and I noticed Anthony Hopkins inside the church.
Anthony has no idea that the jig is up.
My adrenaline got pumped up and I was excited and wanting to get this guy caught. But I was also concerned that because of the children was there, we may have a hostage situation. So I instructed all the officers to hold the positions for a little while until it was safe.
Once the children head back to their pews, police make their move.
I came through the swinging doors, and as I walked down the aisle, everything got real quiet. And I walked up to Anthony Hopkins and I asked him if indeed was his name, and he said yes, it was. So I immediately put handcuffs on him and got him detained.
The reaction of the churchgoers is not what Bagat expected.
The congregation started yelling and screaming and applauding and saying, "Hallelujah, praise the Lord," as I was escorting them back out of the church. And I felt like they was almost happy that I was bringing them out of the church.
They took Anthony out of the front doors. They patted him down, and he asked, "What have I done?"
I looked at him and said, "I don't know, Mr. Hopkins, it may have something to do with the dead body in your deep freeze."
That's when the officer catches his first glimpse of the pastor's dark side.
And he immediately locked his body up and froze. And then in just a few minutes, he asked me, could he speak to his oldest daughter? And I told him, "No, you're not speaking to anyone else."
Hopkins is driven back to Mobile by Detective 𝐁𝐥𝐤𝐸.
I didn't ask him any questions, but all he could seem to talk about was his kids. Where are his kids? How are they doing? He loved his kids. He would never abuse his kids, but not once did he ever ask anything about the wife, Aletha. He didn't question us about what this had to do with Aletha. He just continued to worry about his kids.
The Hopkins children are also taken to police headquarters.
All the kids were real polite and just nice as they could be. I actually asked them if they wanted something to eat, and they all looked to the oldest sibling that was there at that point and said, "No, we don't want anything." We end up taking the oldest sibling in there and talking to her, and she says, "No, my father wouldn't do this," and she denied that there was anything going on between her and her father at that time.
Our interview with 𝐻𝐢𝐿, she denies any allegation of sexual abuse. She denied that her father would even think of her in that way, that 𝐂𝐥𝐤𝐚 must have been lying because her father wouldn't do anything of that nature.
With both Anthony and his stepdaughter Tawanda denying accusations of sexual assault, police are faced with a he said, she said scenario. They turn their focus back on 𝐂𝐥𝐤𝐚 and prepare to ask the biggest question of all. How is it she knew her mother was in the freezer? Alabama preacher Anthony Hopkins has been arrested on suspicion of murder in the death of his wife, Arletha. On April 5, 2010, his trial begins in Mobile. With no cause of death, prosecutor Ashley Rich knows this case could be an uphill battle. Her greatest weapon? 𝐂𝐿𝐸's testimony about the night her mother died. Under oath, this God-fearing teenager reveals even more of her haunting story.
Anthony told 𝐂𝐿𝐸 that God wanted them to clean this up and that they needed to stay together as a family to convince her that she needed to help him move the body. Anthony wrapped Arletha's body in a blanket. 𝐂𝐿𝐸 came into the room and saw her mother's body. Anthony asked 𝐂𝐿𝐸 to help him move the body to their vehicle.
They then drive to a wooded area in the nearby town of Semmes, Alabama.
He just laid her on the ground. He didn't bury her or anything. He just laid her out there in the woods.
Later that night, Anthony worries an animal might find the corpse. Once again, he solicits 𝐂𝐿𝐸's help in moving her mother's remains.
They went back to Semmes to get the body and put 2 garbage cans on either side of the body so that if someone saw, they wouldn't notice that there was a body.
They took her to Jackson, where they buried her in a shed behind the old church where they used to live, in a shallow grave.
When Anthony was burying the body behind the church, a neighbor came over and asked what he was doing. He told the neighbor that he was looking for something in the shed, and the neighbor didn't discover that he was actually burying the body.
After a number of sleepless nights, he panics that his secret will somehow be revealed, and he's right.
While the body was buried in the shallow grave in Jackson, the body began to bloat and become unearthed, and Anthony went back to where he had buried the body.
Anthony and 𝐂𝐿𝐸 move Arletha's remains one last time to a place he alone controls.
They brought her back here to Mobile, where 𝐂𝐿𝐸 said she don't know where her father purchased this freezer from. It was a small freezer that he asked her to help place her mother in. The freezer was kind of small when he brought it back, and he realized that he had to try to squeeze her in there, so he jumped up and down on her body till she fit in the freezer.
It may seem unfathomable that 𝐂𝐿𝐸 would go along with her stepfather's disturbing plot and keep her mother's murder a secret for nearly 4 years. But experts testify that 𝐂𝐿𝐸 and her siblings were systematically abused and manipulated.
By isolating the children from the outside world, that only increases the extent of the control that an individual will have over those children, and consequently have their way with them accordingly.
Testimony from the rest of the Hopkins siblings reveals a lifetime of oppression.
He would leave them in the push-up position for hours at a time, or he would use the extended arm technique, which you hold your arms up for hours and hours at a time in order to punish the kids.
Anthony controlled these children by using the Bible, by using the church, and by manipulating them into doing what he wanted them to do, by saying that that's what God would want them to do, that's what the Bible tells them to do. He would use verbal abuse, physical abuse, and clerical manipulation to get them to do what he thought that they should be doing.
By instilling fear in children, you have a degree of power and control over them. This then allows the individual to have their way, whether it's peace and quiet or sexual gratification.
What these children went through, having their father kill their mother, was excruciatingly painful. But it was even more painful when the case went to trial and the oldest stepdaughter had to testify and tell the community exactly what had happened in that home. She had to live the details again of exactly what happened to her mother, about how they had buried her mother and dug her mother up and then buried her again. And it was extremely traumatic for them to have the whole community know exactly what had transpired in that house at the hands of their stepfather.
Those are the kinds of things you hear on TV. So it was shocking, and it's horrible.
What happened when the lights were out during the storm a few years back? Why didn't we smell anything? That's what I was thinking to myself. You know, maybe that was weird, but I mean, normally you would smell a rotting corpse.
We wanted to make sure at trial that we convinced the jury of the horrific acts that this man had done so that we could put him away for as long as possible so that he could never get back out and harm somebody else.
On May 21st, 2010, after an hour and a half of deliberation, a jury finds Anthony Hopkins guilty of murder, rape, sodomy, incest, and sexual abuse. He is sentenced to life in prison.
It was and continues to be one of the more sensational and bizarre crimes in local memory. A man who is a self-proclaimed prophet and evangelist, a man who's traveling around to area churches claiming to preach the Word of God. He's now accused of killing his own wife and keeping her body in a freezer for 4 years. One of the central questions that arose was, how could Arletha Hopkins have been dead for 4 years and no one outside of their family have noticed or reported that she was missing all that time?
After interviewing a couple of the pastors and see how they didn't recognize or notice that Arletha had been missing all of a sudden out of their lives, it kind of affected me as I didn't want to hear any preacher preach, not that it shook my belief, but more like my belief in man.
Finally free of her father, Shailene tries to put the past behind her and live a normal life.
She has sought counseling and cleared up a lot of the manipulation that was being done to her. She's raising her child, and she is just a great young woman who has overcome adversity and is doing a really good job making sure that her environment and the environment that she raises her children in is healthy and normal.